For the first time in more than 3 years, Mr. Abbott was going to meet with his grandson. For the first time in more than 3 years, William Delacroix Abbott Jr. would be coming back from deployment. Needless to say, Mr. Abbott was quite excited when he woke up this morning, knowing that his grandson would be visiting him after deserting the family for more than 3 years was putting him in the greatest of moods. Mr. Abbott kissed the picture of his wife on the nightstand and passed a finger against her cheek softly. Mrs. Abbott had been gone for about 6 years already, 2 years before William decided to join the army, one after Mr. Abbott moved to a semi-autonomous retirement home. Mr. Abbott, we'll call him Charles, put his feet in his brown and yellow Fentex slippers and wiggled his toes to get his blood to circulate all the way to his extremities. Despite being quite old, Charles prided himself having no heart problems. He always said, 86 years old, and a pumper that could rival that of a young man. Try it, he proudly declared to the array of nurses who gave him the time of day at the retirement home. While he would always remain faithful to Betty, it didn't stop him from teasing them whenever he could. It's not his fault they were so pretty. He had never had that many women dedicated to making sure he felt good, either. It was quite the good stroke on his ego. Charles walked to the closet and chose a simple jean, a black belt, and a blue-gray flannel shirt for his big outing. His grandson was coming over. His grandson. And he said they would be going to the circus. Charles hadn't been to a circus since he had brought a toddler, William Sr., to the big tents over 50 years ago. It didn't matter what they would be doing to him. All he wanted was to spend some quality time with his grandson. He made his way to the kitchen and started his morning routine. He fetched the utensils from the drawers and squinted as he realized they were all still plastic. In this retirement home, the older you get, the more cautious they were about real, cutting kitchen tools. He couldn't even cook on his own because everything was plastic. While Charles didn't mind the food they served him, he didn't like feeling like he was being babied. He was a grown man who didn't need any help, and he proudly declared it to whoever wanted to hear him. So, he took a plastic spoon, a plastic fork, and a plastic knife and brought them over to the table in his small dining room. He slowly walked back to the kitchen, picked a plate from a cabinet as well as plastic glass. He arranged everything neatly, revised the position of the fork, passed a towel over each plastic instrument, and went back to his room. He had exactly 17 minutes before the lady with the rolling tray would knock on his door and ask what he wanted for breakfast. It took him exactly 15 minutes to get dressed and 2 more to walk to the door. 30 seconds later, Diane knocked on his door, and he slicked what was left of his hair back and opened the door with a bright smile. "Good day to you, Charles. Same as usual?" He nodded, but didn't say a word, letting her fill his plate with tasteless scrambled eggs, overcooked bacon, and a slice of tomato that looked sadder than Molly on the 3rd floor. Molly was an old lady who had lost her son in a tragic accident. She hadn't been the same since. Diane wished him a good day and was about to roll out the door when Charles told her a few words. "My grandson is coming today." She looked at him with a puzzled look. It was normal. Charles barely ever talked to her. She wasn't as pretty as the other nurses, after all. Of course he will. Have a nice day, Charles. The door closed behind her, and a smiling Charles made his way to his lunch. When he finished eating, he looked at the clock. Same time as usual. Now, he only had to wait for his grandson to come over. Charles walked over to the couch and decided to close his eyes for a few seconds. He was woken up a few minutes later by the loud buzzing of the reception, calling into his room. "Mr. Abbott, your grandson has come to visit you." He buzzed back and told them he was coming to meet him. Charles picked his hat from the coat hanger and his keys from a wooden cat decoration sticking from the wall, before leaving his little 2 rooms and a half behind him. He locked the door and checked the lock twice before finally getting into the elevator that would get him to the first floor. He realized too late that he had forgotten his cane, but today was a good day. He didn't think he would need it. The weather was positively dry, and his rheumatism wouldn't act up. He didn't need to go up there to get it again. Today was a busy day. The nurses were moving left and right, buzzing like little bees at work. The receptionist's attention was also completely stolen by a couple looking for a place for their mother. Charles' eyes scanned the crowd and he finally found William outside, smoking a cigarette by the entrance. Strangely enough, he was wearing his military uniform. When Charles got out, he asked him why he was wearing his uniform, and of course, if it meant that he was going back soon. William chuckled and only replied that he wanted to make sure Charles would recognize him. Charles felt a little dizzy when the sun hit his eyes, but he walked calmly next to his grandson. He was surprised that they weren't taking his car, and instead were walking toward their destination. William explained that the fairgrounds were just around the corner, 2 streets lower than his retirement home. Charles nodded excitedly. He didn't even know that an event like that was being held so close to where he lived. He was a little tired as they reached the fair. It might have been only a 15-minute walk, but the sun was blazing, and he might have been a little overdressed for the day. If it wasn't for his hat, he was sure that his balding head would be sunburnt. He reached the nearest fountain and drank enough water to make him feel better, but Charles was still a little dizzy. Nonetheless, he didn't want to ruin his day with his grandson, so he didn't say a word. He could deal with dizzy if it meant spending some quality time with William. William and he chatted as they talked about the army. Charles had done his service and participated quite his share of missions before retiring, and so he felt like the both of them were closer than they had ever been with his own son. William Sr., who had chosen to work as a journalist and hadn't done his service, but he was glad that his grandson was a little more patriotic. The day advanced, and they walked through the fair until they reached the big tent. This is where everything happened. The magicians, the clowns, the dancers, the acrobats. It was written that the show started at 2. Looking at his watch, Charles was surprised that it was already close to 2. William had come for him around 10 a.m. this morning, and he thought for sure that only an hour at best had been spent in his company. Good company makes the time fly, apparently. He didn't question it any longer and entered the darkness of the tent to go choose a seat in the front row. Fortunately, the tent was nearly empty, except for a few workers setting up the lighting. Charles sat as comfortably as he could on the wooden bench. When he turned to look at William, he wasn't there. Charles worried for a second, then thought that his grandson might have come to get them some refreshments, which wasn't a bad thing since Charles was starting to feel his throat drying. His lips were parched when he nibbled them, and his tongue felt like sandpaper in his mouth. He closed his eyes for a second and inhaled sharply. When he reopened them, probably a few minutes later and not more, the show was about to start and the tent had filled up with people. There were a lot of kids wearing grotesque clown masks and adults with horns in the crowd, but he attributed it to the frenzy of the circus. Everyone wanted to get in on the mood and nothing else. On his left, a little girl with a doll who had button eyes, just like in his younger years. When he inspected it a little closer, it seemed like the doll's head had been stitched quite a few times. Maybe the little girl's dog had bitten it off. It gave a little creepy vibe to the child's toy, but who was he to question a little girl's choice in toys? Sweat slowly covered his forehead, and Charles took off his hat. Since there were a lot of people in the tent now, the temperature had been rising exponentially. Despite the red and white, black and blue. He was pretty sure the tent was red and white the last time he checked. Under a black tent, and with the high sun outside, it was only natural that it was so hot. What was William doing, taking so much time with the refreshments? He looked left and right, in front of him and behind. Outside of the masks and distorted makeup that made grown-ups look like devils, Charles couldn't see his grandson's friendly face. The old man started to worry a little more and wanted to get out of the tent to go look for him. But soon enough, a crowd leader was illuminated by the spotlight, and the man behind Charles sat him back in his seat. While it was rude of him, Charles understood that while standing up, he was blocking the view. Charles felt uneasy. There was something incredibly strange about this circus tent, and he wasn't only thinking about the black and blue color. The crowd leader was dressed in all black, unlike the usual flashy colors of a circus. Charles swallowed with difficulty because of a lack of saliva in his mouth and looked around him one last time. After announcing the first performer, the crowd cheered, but Charles wasn't sure he heard right. It's only when he saw her on stage that he understood he heard right. Straight from a Tim Burton's nightmare came a human doll with limbs barely holding together by thick iron threads. She started dancing and then flexing, the sound of her bones breaking and her skin tearing, filling the room. The crowd applauded her performance, even as one of her shoulders dislocated, unable to withstand her weight as she held herself against the pole. Her dance made him think of an undead burlesque show. And when she moved closer to where he was sitting, he could clearly smell the flesh in an advanced stage of putrefaction. His heart rose in his throat, and he gagged as she winked at him, her whitened irises rolling back into her skull. Once she was done with her show, Charles wanted nothing more than to leave this tent. Once again, he tried to leave, but the man behind him sat him back down. And he was forced to watch as a pair of clowns got on the stage. Their face painting made them look like a devious pantomimes. Black and white, with lips so bloody red, it looked like they buried their teeth in human flesh and were splattered with the victim's blood. Charles became even dizzier. They strolled on their deathly unicycles across the round stage and pinched the black carnation pinned to their outfit, splattering a red liquid to the front row seats. When it sprinkled him, Charles panicked. It was blood, thick and warm, as if it had just been ripped from a body. An audible gasp escaped him, but it was drowned by the cheering crowd. He tried to stand up again, but was forced back on his seat, this time more intently. His eyes closed for a second, and when he reopened them, the clowns were reenacting the famous scarf tricks, but instead of pulling scarves out of their sleeves, they were pulling boiling guts. Their putrid, bloody smell reached his nose, and Charles whimpered. For the first time, he screamed loudly and called for William's name. Again, he tried to leave, but the man behind him was determined to keep him rooted to his seat. The clown's bloody hands moved to the next famous trick of juggling. Many bowling pins, but they weren't bowling pins. They were bones and skulls, and their bloody fingers left an imprint on the ivory. There were still bouts of flesh hanging loosely at the extremity of certain bones, and Charles thought he was going to lose consciousness. It's only when he saw William's head between one of the clown's hands that he finally fought his way out. He pinched the man behind him in the gut, slammed his fist in another's face as he tried to escape into the bright sun, out of the tent run by the devil himself. Hands trapped him, and he was locked in place, but he tried to bite, he tried to kick, and he tried to fight with everything he's got. "Let me go, you demons! William! William, where are you?" Sir, we'll need you to calm down. You are scaring the kids." When Charles reopened his eyes, he had been stopped by officers, out in the sun, in a park full of children. They called the retirement home where he lived, and he was escorted to his room. Lucy, a young nurse, gave him his medications. "Where's William? I want to see my grandson. He'll believe me." Lucy wiped Charles' sweaty forehead and made him drink some water so he could swallow his medication. "Mr. Abbott, William died 2 years ago when he was deployed. You need to stop walking out of here and going to the park to scare the kids, or we're going to have to transfer you to another facility."